One of the best things in gaming, whether it be in the indie space or AAA or anything in between, is when a game totally catches you off guard. For me, the game that sums that up best from EGX 2018 was Obsoleet. Obsoleet came out of nowhere for me. I turned the corner, looked at it, thought it looked cool, had an interesting concept, played it, and then it totally captured my attention and had me hooked for the rest of the game. In fact, for the rest of the day, I was thinking about Obsoleet. So I hope you'll enjoy this, one of the final interviews of our EGX 2018 Extravaganza. This is Obsoleet. So, my favourite thing about EGX is walking around the corner of an indie booth and finding something that you didn't expect to see in gaming that week. It's something special that you can only find here, and I'm here with Poppy, who has just that. Hello.
Hello there.
How are you?
I'm pretty good.
Awesome. So you are here telling us and demoing Obsoleet.
Yes, I am.
What is Obsoleet?
Obsoleet is an explorative narrative game set in a vaporpunk, which is vaporwave meets cyberpunk future, where everything's government controlled, and you play as a hacker who just happens to be a wheelchair user.
So there are a couple of things that are really unique about the game that I've seen so far. And the first thing I want to talk about before we get onto the mechanics of it and the playing it is the aesthetic. I loved what you said earlier about cyberpunk not having to be gritty and dark. I'm fond of a gritty and dark cyberpunk, love Blade Runner, but I love this as well. It's really, really pretty in a way I haven't seen in a long while. How did it come about?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for the compliment.
You're very welcome.
Secondly, it came about from the fact that, first off, we love cyberpunk. Everyone on our team loves cyberpunk, also big Blade Runner fans. But we got really fed up of the fact that all cyberpunk, and often quite a lot of all sci-fi, is often very dark. Most stories are often very dark, and it's always like dark story, dark environment, everything's miserable. Instead, we were like, why not have a dark story, but the environment doesn't have to reflect that. The future, even if things are government controlled and kind of miserable and dystopian, that doesn't mean the world has to fall into darkness. So why not embrace another aesthetic we love and make it pastel and make it vaporwave and parallel that like 90s tech aesthetic, but in the future, because that actually works quite well with the idea of cyberpunk, where things are kind of futuristic but run down. So why not bring the 90s into it?
There's something really, really honest about it, like something that's always bugged me about games. I love my cyberpunk games, Deus Ex is great, but you play them and they seem to not know that the daytime exists, whereas this feels like it has like a real world to it, and I really appreciate that. So the main kind of core, I suppose, USP, but that's not really like a good way of putting it, is that you play as a wheelchair user, which hugely affects the way you move around the game world. It didn't dawn on me how much it would affect it until I played the game, and I imagine you've heard that quite a lot. Can you tell me a little bit about how you came to the idea and then how you went about making it authentic as well?
Of course. So the idea actually came from the fact that this was initially an honours project from one of our other team members that we took forward. And her honours project dealt with the idea of creating diverse characters by just asking people in the demographic. The idea that you do not have to come from a demographic to create characters from them, and the diverse characters can be so many different people because there's so many people in the world and we don't see enough of it. So we really wanted to include representation of disabilities in that, because almost every game that includes a disability takes one of two paths. Either they are really kind of depressing, such as when Chloe in Life is Strange is in a wheelchair and then gets asked for you to kill her, or you just get your, like, if you get a leg cut off or broken, you just replace it with a rocket leg, and sci-fi just fixes you. And we were like, that's not as simple as that. And there's nothing, like, there's plenty of people in the world that are in a manual wheelchair, and they're perfectly happy with that.
Yeah.
So we wanted to show that, and we wanted to show a whole range of people, and the fact that that could create really interesting gameplay, because it forces you to use controls you'd never considered, to puzzle around the world in ways you hadn't considered. It gives this whole almost platforming, explorative element to it that's really interesting. So going about developing it, we actually approached a couple of people that were in wheelchairs themselves and asked them, what is it you want to see? What annoys you? What do you want included? And we took that forward and made it, and then played it off of them to make sure that, like, sent it back and forward between them, making sure that we were getting what they wanted. And then we also got a wheelchair ourselves and went about in it so as we ourselves could get a better idea of what it's like to move around, and then make sure that the coding and the mechanics reflected that.
The reason that I stopped to play was it's beautiful, it's really pretty, it looks like a really interesting game, but I heard you mention my two favourite words at EGX, which is special effects. Special effects are such a wonderful special thing. If you don't know them, we've interviewed them for 3 years now. Please go and listen to it. They deserve the traffic. But this is the kind of thing that really shows what special effects and what these kind of games are good for, are meant to be doing, and how they can push things in a good way. Giving you the experience of a world that you would have just never had before is something I think only video games can do. And it's really nice to see it coming from a small team doing it so purely. It's really, really great.
Thank you very much.
You're very welcome.
We really appreciate it.
So tell us a little bit about your history in gaming. You've done far more than just making games. You've written about them. You've got cool business cards. Tell us all of that.
So basically, I started off before I went to university as a games columnist. I worked as a games columnist for 4 years throughout while I started university, and I initially went to college and then uni training as a computer artist for games. So I worked as a writer for a few different sites, mostly looking at overlooked games and things that people maybe hadn't touched, because the indie scene and like the small time scene is something I'm really passionate about, especially narrative-based games. And then I went and studied, and I've just graduated from doing computer arts. So now I've taken part in DARE and produced this game, and we're now showing EGX for the first time, which is mental. Showing my first ever game 20 meters away from Kingdom Hearts 3, which is the reason I went into games in the first place, and with my booth right beside Worms is like insane. But yeah, I now do this, and I'm also working as a games narrative designer, looking to hopefully do a master's in writing, so as I can then go forward and work on writing inclusive and different and interesting stories for various different games companies.
Awesome. So a big history in video games. I'm going to predict a fairly big future in video games as well.
Fingers crossed.
Absolutely. Well, this has been an absolute pleasure. If you don't, you should go and look at Obsoleet, whether it's out now or whether it's out in the future or whenever you're hearing this. Like, search the people down. Where can they find you? You
can find us on Twitter at SodaFloat Games. SodaFloat is our dev team. We're going to be keeping updated with the hope to have our demo out by the end of this year, which is 2018. And hopefully, if everything goes according to plan, launch our first episode in 2019.
Shout out to demos in 2018 as well. Also, you've got one of the best dev names in this place as well, SodaFloat.
Thank you.
Very good.
Honestly, I was just craving one when I made the dev team name.
Oh, see, I don't even like SodaFloats, and now I want one. Check them out, find them out. They deserve your attention. This is real cool. And that's us done. Thanks.
It was lovely to meet you.
And that is our penultimate episode of this, one of our favourite series is to do every year. Next week we have a double whammy for you to close us out in the month of October. So stay tuned for that. Remember, you can find us on all the socials at Games Upcast on everything: iTunes, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube and Twitch. And you can subscribe to the show so that you don't miss it, so that you don't miss next week's episode and all the other podcasty stuff we publish. Thanks very much. We really appreciate it. And until next week, the game's up.